Want to save time, money, and your sanity while planning your wedding? Subscribe to Wedding Planning Podcast Premium on Apple Podcasts for early ad-free access to all weekly episodes. Plus, an exclusive bonus series that outlines exactly how to use ChatGPT to your advantage with dedicated meetings for customizing your budget, finding the perfect venue, hiring your vendors, and so much more. Save hours of time, avoid tons of wedding overwhelm, and make confident decisions faster. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts and start planning with clarity. Enjoy the show. Why, hello there, and welcome to this week's episode of the Wedding Planning Podcast. I hope you're having a great week, and I really hope that you're finding our time here each Wednesday helpful as you are planning out and navigating all the details of your beautiful upcoming wedding. So today I have a full show on just some general advice for finding your perfect team of wedding vendors. Now, there are different phases to this. There's a research phase, an outreach phase, an actual contract negotiation phase, a booking phase. So lots of different pieces here. We're just going to kind of have a general overview conversation and go through a few main points that I'm going to summarize here. I will include a link to a full written recap in the show description for this episode. So take a look there when you have a hands-free moment, and you can have at a glance easy retrieval of all these kind of checklist items that we're going to run through today. So as promised, here's our show outline. Here is where we are headed. I'm going to share some very general research advice for finding your dream team of wedding vendors. I'm also going to run through a flow chart that details the most important vendors, some that are maybe nice to have if you have the budget, and then also a category of vendors that are fully optional. We're going to talk about a timeline of what to book first and what can wait until later. I have key questions that you should be asking every wedding vendor you interact with. And last but certainly not least, I have a set of universal budgeting guidelines that you can keep and refer to as you are hiring your vendors over the coming months. So let's get started at the top. Some general research advice for finding the best vendors for you. As you may already have found out or be in the process of finding out, hiring your vendors is a big, huge project. It's not a one and done. It's not a sit down over one weekend and hammer it out. It's an ongoing project that spans months and weeks of your overall engagement season. If you are someone who is open and receptive to using ChatGPT or similar AI-based tools, my recommendation would be to take advantage of that. I am not here to change anyone's mind on AI. I have zero vested interest in whether or not you ever touch ChatGPT as you're planning your wedding. I would like to offer that this can be a huge time saver. ChatGPT is not good at everything in the wedding planning world. Please hear me very clearly on that. I do not advocate to use this for writing vows, for interacting with your family members, for human touch, creative endeavors, and ways that you're trying to interact with your guests or provide a unique experience. All right. So once again, please hear me very loud and clear. ChatGPT/AI is not good at everything. For our purposes here today, it is really good at taking a humongous job like researching wedding photographers in Atlanta, Georgia, and within 10 seconds can have compiled a full list of resources, people to reach out to, further information, advice, ideas, etc. That work with you doing Google searches is going to take much longer than 10 seconds. I can promise you that. If you are interested in taking advantage of that tool and you would like to learn more, I just within the past few weeks posted a complete bonus series on some of the core things that ChatGPT is really good at when it comes to wedding planning. Those are available for my premium subscribers. I mention it at the intro to every show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, all you need to do is tap subscribe and you'll have instant access to those exclusive bonus shows. Now, shifting gears, if you are not going to use ChatGPT, that's totally fine. You're going to use the option of individual internet searches and then outreach to those vendors who pique your interest. For much more of a warm search, I would suggest asking for referrals from your friends and family or anyone you know, satellite friends and family who's recently been married, and go ahead and get their thoughts on some people you could contact. Another really good way to find high quality vendors is to browse social media using local filters. I personally am not a big user of any social platform at all, really. So, depending on where you enjoy hanging out and get value, go ahead and drill down to like a localized search and see what you can find that way. And then my final advice here in terms of just general research is ask any existing vendors who you have already hired for their recommendations of other people who you can work with. For example, if you have booked your venue, you may want to go ahead and ask your contact there, who are some of the wedding planners or day of coordinators who have worked with that venue many, many times? Who are their trusted caterers, bartenders, transportation companies, etc. Depending on your venue, some of this is oftentimes built in, oftentimes called preferred vendors. So you may actually not have a lot of element of choice when it comes down to, certain products and services. But if it has not been spelled out that you do have to work with preferred vendors, then asking someone like a venue or asking a wedding coordinator who you maybe already have committed to working with for their referrals can be a huge time saver. And if you like and trust that person, it's a really, really good way for you to find good, trustworthy people who are great at the things that they do. Next on our list for today, I'm going to share a comprehensive list of just all the vendors that you could possibly need or want. So if you're early in the planning process and you're just kind of drawing a blank or not knowing where to start, here's a very general list of very important vendors that most couples will need to hire. I'm going to touch on vendors that are nice to have, but totally optional. And then I also have some vendors that are fully optional if you have the budget, if you want to take the stress off your plate, etc. So, our must-have vendors. So, first off, we have the most high level, like popular vendors that most couples will wind up hiring or needing. First up is your venue, where you're going to hold your celebration. This may include a ceremony site and a reception site. If these can both be at the same place, that to me is a huge bonus. We went into that in much more detail in a conversation on your venue. I'm not going to go too far with that right now. The next vendor that most couples will hire is some form of catering and bar service. Typically, a wedding celebration comes along with some form of eating food and drinking some type of beverage. So you'll want to have that taken care of. The next vendor, very popular photographer. We also have videographer, kind of goes hand in hand with that. A planner and or day of wedding coordinator is going to be very helpful for most of you and essential for many of you. Now, as I'm reading this list out, does this have to be a professional with decades of experience who costs thousands of dollars? Absolutely not. It can be a friend, it can be a family member, but these are roles that will need to be filled likely by somebody. Next on our list of essential or most popular vendors would be a DJ or live band, some form of entertainment. You'll also need some form of officiant, whether that's someone who's religious, someone who's not religious, or simply a friend or family who you choose. Many couples will hire a professional to do their flowers and or decorations. And now we're going to move into, actually that one to me is kind of on the line of our next little category here, which is recommended, but definitely not necessary. So let's move florist and decor down into this category. I personally think that doing your own flowers is one of the easiest DIY projects. It can be a lot of fun and it can be a real big bang for your buck. Also, in the recommended slash optional vendors, we have equipment rentals. This can be anything like lighting, stereo system, sound system. We also have a category of rentals that's more like your tables, your chairs, your linens, and then any dishware, glasses, flatware, silverware, heaters if you're in a cold climate, a tent if you're in a rainy or wet climate, etc., etc. Other optional vendors, hair and makeup artists. You may have inclination to do your own hair and makeup, which is amazing. Again, a DIY that I think is totally worth taking on. But if you would like to hire a professional for that, that would be your hair and makeup artists, also referred to as HMU. Next up, transportation. Depending on where your guests are staying and where your venue, ceremony, and reception site are actually located, you may need to hire and or arrange for separate transportation to get your guests to and from where they need to be. Next up, we have a bakery for cake and or any specialty desserts that you would like to share. And then we have stationery, which I feel like most people who listen to this show and I hear from, you're ordering stationery off a website and not necessarily hiring an individual to make you very custom, bespoke wedding invitations, but that would be an optional vendor that you could think of looking into. And then also we have specialty entertainment providers. This would be anything like a photo booth, a video setup where your guests are recording messages for you. It could be lawn games, a band for your cocktail hour, a magician, a caricature artist, a cigar bar, etc., etc., etc. And then last handful of totally optional vendors, nice to have if you have the budget. This would be specialty decor and styling companies. This is couples who are setting up a really custom lounge area, renting really custom furniture, looking for backdrops, arches, flower walls, anything like that. We also have transportation for the couple's exit. I feel like that's gotten a little bit less common these days, but if you were renting a vintage car or a classic truck to do your grand exit, childcare services, depending on your situation, that could be a very valuable add to your wedding guests. And then attire vendors. So we're talking about the dress shop, the suit rental, and any alterations that you need to have done. That would be another vendor that you would be researching and looking into working with. So, with all that said, I just listed off about 20 different vendors who provide a wide variety of different services. What do we need to book first, and what can wait until later? I'm going to run through the top 7 vendors who I think it's pretty important that you get on the books and get figured out within the 12 to 9 months before your wedding. Obviously, this doesn't apply to every single one of you, but it is a good general starting point. First up would be your venue. I think it's really important to get your venue in the books for a variety of reasons. I went into these in great detail in our venue show that ran just a couple of weeks ago. Go back and have a listen if you haven't already. But your venue is really going to set the vibe and set the scene for every other vendor that you hire. So I do think it's good to have a solid, concrete, locked in venue before you move on and start hiring other people. Next up, we want catering and food and drinks locked in. If it's not included in your venue package, this is something good just to have set at the very beginning. Your photography is a big priority for many, many couples, so it is important to get that locked in and confirmed. Definitely one of the vendors whose calendars book up very, very quickly. Next up, a DJ or music and entertainment. You want to have an officiant identified and reserved for your date, and then also a coordinator or day of coordinator. This is an optional vendor to hire in a professional sense. I said a few minutes ago, it doesn't need to be a day of coordinator who has a decade of experience and charges you $3,000. This can be a friend, a family member, a satellite friend or family. You will need someone to coordinate the logistics on the day of, and that someone should not be you. This is a topic that I've talked about in many, many shows past, so you've likely heard me talk about that topic specifically. There are some wedding planner and day of coordinator specific episodes that are available. So if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, go back and feel free to find those and listen. They are important. When you're newly engaged and wondering where to even start, one of the easiest first steps is your wedding website. With Minted, you can build a free wedding website designed by independent artists, so it looks elevated without the custom design price tag. Everything lives in one place: your story, wedding details, RSVPs, and registry links. It's simple, clean, and stress-free. Head to weddingplanningpodcast.co/minted to get started today and unlock exclusive listener perks on save the dates, invitations, and more. All right, so now we know the vendors we're shopping for. We know who to book first, who's the top priority. The next thing we're going to talk about are some key questions that you can be asking every wedding vendor who you're interacting with or interviewing. You do not need to write these down. I will include all of this in the written recap of today's show that you can find in the show description when you have a hands-free moment. Here are the key questions. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. Number one, are you available on our wedding date? Pretty obvious. If someone is not available on your given date, then that ends that conversation really, really quickly. Number two, how many weddings do you take on in a single day or a single weekend? This is going to give you some information on how stretched thin that vendor may be and whether or not your wedding will be their single priority. What's included in your base package? You also want to follow up with what is not included, and are there any things that commonly get added on by other couples? This question is getting at your total bottom line out the door cost and prevents surprises from cropping up down the road. Number five, what's your pricing structure and how do payments work? You want to know the total cost range that you can expect to spend. It's very important to understand the deposit amount, the payment schedule for any balance due, and their accepted payment methods. If you're working with someone who's giving you vague answers or feels like they're reluctant to talk about money, to talk about deposits, to talk about the cost range, that to me is a red flag and you might want to move on. I believe in full transparency. Are there surprises? Are there unexpected things that come up? Yes, of course. But if there's someone who's like wishy-washy on talking about this kind of stuff, again, that to me is a big red flag. Another very important question: what is your cancellation and refund policy? You deserve and need to know if your deposit is non-refundable. What happens if this vendor cancels? What happens if they go out of business? What happens if they're sick? What happens if there is a disaster? Are you on the hook for that deposit? What are the next steps? And last little piece of this question: what if you have to postpone due to illness or some other unforeseen circumstance? And next question, this is number 7. What if there's an emergency and you can't be at our wedding? What's the backup plan? They should be able to professionally and clearly describe to you what their backup plan is. If they have a network of trusted replacements, so people they could call to send in an absolute pinch or emergency. And flashing forward to actually signing a contract, all of these things should be clearly delineated and outlined within that contract. If they don't have a backup plan, if they cannot express the plan for unforeseen disasters to you in a very clear and sensical way, then again, red flag. Another great question. Have you worked at our venue before? Are you familiar with the staff, with the layout? Do you carry liability insurance? Oftentimes, venues are going to require this of specific vendors, not always, but important question to ask. Do you have a sample contract we can review before taking the next steps? And then, of course, when you do take the next steps, you are going to be reviewing and signing a contract. That's a whole other topic for another show for another day. I know right offhand, I definitely have a dedicated episode to items in your venue contract to be aware of. If you would be interested in learning more about that, go ahead and search up that past episode. And then last bit here, it's related, but it's not really a question, and it has to do with looking at past reviews from other clients. I think that is going to be such a strong indicator of this overall vendor's reliability, trustworthiness, ability to do a good job. Go on the internet and find what real couples who have actually worked with this person have to say. People are very candid when it comes to leaving reviews online via Google review, Yelp review, on Facebook, in podcast reviews, wink, wink. Something about being behind your keyboard just brings out every candid bone in certain people. So you should be able to get a very clear and very honest look at how this vendor has actually performed for past couples. All right, so that's your list of key questions, kind of universal questions that you can ask various vendors who you're interviewing and looking to work with. And then to wrap up today's episode, we are going to talk about some universal budgeting guidelines that you can refer back to as you are researching and hiring vendors. Guideline number one here is that you must have a working budget in place before you go out and willy-nilly start hiring people. This to me is non-negotiable wedding planning 101. If you don't have a budget in place that's realistic for you and your partner and you go out and start booking people, then we're relying on wishful thinking and hope. And that doesn't work with mathematics. Your real budget is what you can realistically afford to pay for this wedding, taking into account all of the specific things we talked about in an episode dedicated to formulating your budget just a couple weeks ago. Please do not skip this part. Please do not gloss over it. Please do yourselves a favor and pause on any commitments, any vendor hiring until you have that budget really dialed in. Another good general rule of thumb as you're shopping for various vendors is to just assume that every vendor has add-ons. Assume that the price you are initially given or the price you initially see on their website is a starting point, and you're going to encounter a variety of upsells, if you want to call them that. And this could look like extra hours, second shooters, assistants, premium add-ons, upgrades, for example, to your lighting, your sound system, your decor, your tablescapes, and then service fees and administrative fees. Service fees are going to be built into many/most venue contracts, catering contracts. So be sure you're understanding that and be sure that you are building in a range as you're identifying your budget line items. For example, if your budget for photography is $3,000, then you should probably be looking out for photographers who are advertising about a $2,200 to $2,500 starting package price to allow yourself some buffer. I just made up that number on the spot, but the general idea is the same. Leave yourself some buffer and leave yourself some range as you are delineating those line items in your budget. Another good general question to ask vendors is, what do most couples end up paying for this package or service? So again, if your quote for the photographer is $2,200 and you say, okay, great, that's very helpful information. Thank you for sharing that. Given that number $2,200, what do most couples end up actually paying after we do a second shooter, extra hours, printed photo books or albums or prints or whatever else? If the answer is most couples end up spending $2,200, that includes everything shown here, and you feel like that's everything that you're going to need, then that's great. Keep yourselves organized by really understanding your payment schedule and really having a way to track what is due and when. Having 3 or 4 large balance due payments come up the month before your wedding is going to add some unnecessary stress. So if there's any way to stagger those or to schedule those so that everything isn't showing up in your lap, at the 11th hour, then that would be a benefit. Not always possible, but if it is, it's a good way to take some stress off your plate. Another important vendor guideline, please keep in mind we have our working budget. If you decide to splurge in one category, that's totally fine. That happens all the time. When you sit down in the beginning and you jot down your priorities and you and your partner agree these are our top 3 to 5 priorities, it's totally natural for that to change and shift as you move on and start making plans and making decisions and things start coming together. However, if you wind up splurging in one place, please remember that you must downgrade in another space. This is pure and simple mathematics. So if you want to spend a little more on your venue or splurge a little more than you initially thought on your photographer, add a live band instead of just a recorded track for cocktail hour, great. Then you need to, on the other hand, either simplify something else, cut something else out, maybe take a DIY path. You just need to compensate for that. And to wrap this show up, I would love to say that any vendor who respects your priorities, your wants, your vision, and your budget, that's the goal and that's a keeper. Many of us in the wedding industry are self-employed small business owners, and to most of us, having our clients happy, having our clients enjoy an unforgettable wedding experience, that is our number one goal. So as you're talking to people, as you're reaching out and getting quotes back, as you're having meetings, keep that in mind. If the person sitting across from you or on a Zoom call or however you're doing it, if you're not getting vibes that they are genuinely interested in making your wedding experience a success, then that's a big red flag. And I would suggest moving on and finding someone else, because I do know from firsthand experience that there are tens of thousands of dedicated, reliable, amazingly talented vendors out there, and you deserve to work with those. Okay, I think that wraps up our conversation for today. I hope you found some helpful nugget in today's show. I know we covered a lot. One more reminder, I will put a written recap of all of these questions, all of these general points in a written recap that you can find a link to in today's show notes. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Please feel free to share today's show with anyone who's helping you plan, and I hope you have a great day.